So the next topic has to do with dominant and keystone species. Species have different impacts on ecosystems. Some species have really large impacts. Some species have very little impact on an ecosystem and ecosystem processes. So one category of species that has a large impact is called a dominant species. This is a species with high biomass, and it has a large impact because there are a lot of individuals of that species. Differently is what's called a keystone species. It's low biomass, so there aren't very many of them, but they have a very large impact, even though they have this low abundance. And a keystone is this stone in an arch. And it's the one that holds the whole arch together and keeps it from falling down. And so that's kind of a metaphor for a keystone species. It's something that keeps an ecosystem working the way it's been working, even though there's not a lot of those individuals. A lot of times keystone species are top predators, but they're not always top predators. And we'll talk a little bit more here. So this graph kind of describes the impacts of different species and how many of them there are. And they're looking at biomass by weight, just because, the number of individuals of a tree versus the number of individuals of an ant can be very different, but the biomass makes it a little bit easier to compare them. So on the y-axis here, we have the impact of species, and on the x-axis, we have the proportional biomass of the species. So we're just talking about dominant species. These are species that have a lot of biomass and a lot of impact on the ecosystem. So these are things like trees in a forest. They're dominant. There's a lot of biomass of trees in a forest, and they also are really important to the ecosystem. Other things are like deer, kelp, prairie grasses can be dominant species. Another species that we just talked about, or a group of species, is the keystone species. So they have high impact, just like dominant species, but there's very low biomass. So things like bats, ticks that cause diseases can control different populations, and then predators like wolves. If we come down here, these are species that have lower impacts on the ecosystem, but common species have high biomass. So there are things like grasses, shrubs, a lot of plants in these examples. And then there are rare species. These have low impact, but also low biomass. So it might be like a rare butterfly or a moss. They don't have a large impact on the ecosystem. They are part of the biodiversity. So some examples of keystone species. I said some of them are predators, like wolves. Some of them change the environment in a particular way. And so a special kind of keystone species is also called an ecosystem engineer, and they modify or create habitat. And beavers are a great example of this. They change a fast-flowing stream into basically a pond by damming up the stream. And it totally changes how that aquatic ecosystem works and what kinds of organisms can live there. So ecosystem engineers are often keystone species. So you can think of the beaver as a great example. Keystone species can be really helpful to identify for conservation because if we protect a keystone species, it can protect a large part of the ecosystem because it's so important for the ecosystem. If we're talking about predators, losing a keystone species can cause a trophic cascade, which is where we get an increase in the amount of herbivores because the predator is removed. So the herbivore isn't being regulated by the predator, and their population just go way up because there's nobody eating them anymore. And that can have major negative effects on the primary producers or the plants. So a classic example that we'll talk about a few times in this class is wolves in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And so wolves eat deer and elk, and they also scare them. And that keeps them from the deer and elk from eating too much of the vegetation. And we've seen dramatic changes in what the ecosystem in Yellowstone looks like after wolves were removed. And then they've since been returned to Yellowstone. And we've again seen these changes from a trophic cascade in those ecosystems. So what happens when we lose a keystone species? Because they're supporting communities, their loss can often result in the loss of other species from the ecosystem. This is called an extinction cascade. So it's like the trophic cascade, but we see other species go extinct because they were relying on that keystone species. And we think that this might be happening in some tropical forests where bird and mammal species are disappearing, and the trees are still there, but because the birds and mammals are no longer there, there are no animals to distribute seeds and to be pollinators. So we think we're going to lose some of these trees in the future and some of the other smaller plants because they really rely on some of these mammals and birds as seed dispersers and pollinators. Another term is called a keystone resource, and that's a really important resource that is important for a functional ecosystem. So if we take that resource away, the ecosystem will no longer function the way it was before. And so classic examples of these are like salt licks and mineral pools where birds and mammals get nutrients they need that they can't get from their food. And so you can see here on the right, this is called a bai in Africa. And it's a clearing that has very mineral-rich water and mud. And you can see the elephants come out of the forest here to drink the water. And lots of animals do this as well. And it provides these kind of trace elements that you can get sick. It's like a vitamin that the animals can take by coming to this resource. But we'd probably lose species without this important keystone resource, and that would change how the ecosystem functions. So that's why we call this a keystone resource. Same thing with salt licks. So here we can see all these macaws, these birds, getting salt from this salt lick. Salt is really important because it helps our cells function, and we all know that too much salt isn't good, but out in the wild where they're not adding salt to all their food, a little bit of extra salt also often can be really important. Ecosystems in which all processes are functioning normally are called healthy ecosystems. And that doesn't mean that there's no disturbance. Disturbance can be helpful, and it's any force that disrupts established patterns of species diversity, abundance, community structure, or ecosystem processes. And good examples of these include storms, fires, logging, hurricanes, those sorts of things. In a healthy ecosystem, when a disturbance occurs, the ecosystem is able to recover after the disturbance takes place. In an unhealthy ecosystem, it loses its ability to function in some ways. It might not retain as much water during storms. It might not decompose materials as well. And it has a harder time returning back to normal after a disturbance occurs. And this process is called resilience, and we'll talk about this a bunch during the class. But it's the ability for ecosystems to come back to where they were after a disturbance or after losing some species. Ecosystems that remain in the same state over a long time are called stable ecosystems. And the stability can be due to lack of disturbances, or it could be due to resilience. So that means that they come back to the same state after these disturbances. Stability does not necessarily mean that it's healthy, and it is important to remember that. If it's stable despite disturbance, this could be due to resistance, which is the ability to remain in the same state despite a disturbance, and resilience is the ability to return back to the same state quickly after a disturbance. So an example of resilience might be a grassland and a fire sweeps through and burns up all the grass. But if the grass regrows quickly after the fire, which often happens, then we would say that that's a pretty resilient ecosystem to the disturbance of fire. Another example is when fish are introduced to fish-free ponds, many species disappear, so they have low resistance. But the same species might return quickly once the fish are removed, so that would be high resilience.